Hey guys, so welcome to a new series I'm going to be doing for C++. Firstly, we'll start with some basic stuff like variables and loops, then we'll move on to some intermediate stuff such as functions, pointers, and classes. Then we'll move on to more advanced stuff like inheritance and data structures. Okay, so as part of this tutorial, we'll be using the CLion IDE from JetBrains, but you can also use VS Code. Just make sure you have the C++ plugin installed. So to start with C++, we first have to include our first library, the IO stream, which stands for Input-Output Stream. This library will allow us to output information to the user in the form of Cout and take information from the user in the form of Cin. So to include this library, we first have to have a hashtag include followed by a less than and greater than sign. And inside of those less than and greater than sign, we would then put out libraries, so IO stream, right? So to start writing C++ code, we have to encapsulate our code inside of a main function. We'll talk about functions later, but for now, I'll just show you guys how to set up the main function. So the first thing you need to do is to define the return type. So for this main function, we just return a simple int, right? So we define int. After that, you want to have a name for that function. So we'll call our function main. So after that, you can have a parameter field. So these two parentheses is where you will put your parameters inside of here, right? Let's start running C++ code, but how? So first we need to encapsulate our function inside of curly braces. This defines the scope that we're going to be writing in, and this is where we will write our code. So before we start writing any other real code, let's return something. So we have to return 0. So we have to return an integer before this program can finish running. Because if we don't return something, the program will error out. So in C++, you have to end a statement with a semicolon. Okay, so let's start writing our first program. So we are going to be sending out a message saying hello world to the console, right? But to do that in C++, is because every time we write something, we have to do std to call the standard definition, right? So let's say we want to do std cout, we have to do this every single time. But instead of doing that, let's just say that we're going to be using the namespace everywhere. So we're going to be using std everywhere, right? So namespace standard. This basically means that we're using namespace for an entire program, and it's going to be the standard definition. So we don't have to include the std set 2 colons afterwards. Then we end the statement, right? So basically what this is saying is that we don't have to input to this anymore. We just cout, right? So to call cout, we just call cout, and then we have two less than signs. This signifies that we're sending something out. And what do we want to send out? We want to send out a message, a string, with hello world, right? And then we want to have an end line afterwards. So we have two more less than signs, and we also have an end line. End line basically means that we're going to have a new line once we finish writing this out. And since this is a statement, you have to end it with a semicolon. So now let's start talking about variables and data types. So you can think of variables as like a box holding something. So let's define that box. In C++, we have to let the compiler know what our box is. So we are going to be storing an integer, and let's give it a name. So we're going to be calling this number, right? Now we have to put something inside of the box. So we have to assign it. It's equal to 10, right? And we also have to close it with a semicolon. So let's talk a little bit about memory. So in C++, memory is very, very important. So an integer, it usually has 4 bytes. So you can think of bytes like in today we're using gigabytes and megabytes. Gigabytes are usually a billion bytes and megabytes are a million bytes, right? So an integer is just 4 bytes. Let's talk about another data type. So a float. You can think of a float as like a decimal. So whenever you want to store something with a decimal in it, you will use a float instead of an integer. So 10.25, this will be a float. If you want to print this out or cout it, it will print out this exact statement. But let's say you want to change this into an int, then the 0.25 would just be removed. So let's say you had 1.75. What does this mean? Well, logically you'll expect this to round up to 11, right? But no, if it's an int, it would just get rid of whatever the decimal is. And how many bytes does this float take up? So it'll take up 4 bytes, same thing as an int. So let's talk about another data type, booleans. So booleans are 1 byte, and they're usually just a true or false statement. So true or false, right? Like that. So let's talk about another one, a character. What is a character? So you can think of a character as like a letter, right? A single letter. And when you define a character, you have to use single quotes. You can't use double quotes. And you can put any character inside of it. And they're 1 byte each. So let's think of a double. A double is another important one, and you can think of it as a more accurate float. And it can store very, very long like decimal points. So you can store pi and stuff like that. So a float is 32-bit and a double is 64-bit. So a double can store twice as many data. And a double is 8 bytes. So twice as many. So now let's talk about strings. So strings are not natively included into C++, so we have to include it, right? So we have to do hashtag include, and we have to include what? String. String is a standard definition, so yeah, it is bundled with C++, but it's not included automatically. So to make a string, you have to first declare that it's a string, and then you give it a name, right? So you can think of a string as like a word, right? So a complete word. And yeah, so strings are basically just lists or containers of characters. So a word is multiple characters basically. So, and you would define a string with double quotes, and then you will put something inside of it. So character. And how many bytes would this be? This would be 9 bytes, right? Because there's 9 characters in it, and each character are a single byte. You could think of strings as basically an array, which is something we'll get into later, but an array of characters. So if you want to access the word, you can then just use a square bracket notation to go inside of this array and print out whatever inside of it, right? So let's say we want to print out the second element, so the H in there. You will then just do 1, right? So now we also have 2 different things that you can assign to your data type. So you can have assign, which basically means if you attach it to an int, basically means that you're allowed negative. So sign int basically means that your integer can be both positive and negative, but you can also have an unsigned int. And basically that means that it can only be positive. It can never be negative. So yeah, that's it for today. Thank you guys for watching. Bye bye.